Well, welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome David Pitt-Watson here. We were talking about what David has done with his life, and I had looked at the Wikipedia entry, and it led me to ask, did he, like so many other people, begin at McKinsey's? And the answer is yes, but only for a summer vacation. He was originally a PPE student here, and then has done a number of interesting things in the fund management space, which includes being treasurer to the Labour Party, which is rather a long way from the fund management space, and now a non-executive, and now the treasurer of Oxfam, and a non-executive director at KPMG. So a very wide range of experience. He's just published this book, What They Do With Your Money, How the Financial System Fails Us and How to Fix It, which has a title very like Colin Mayer's book, which is just called Other People's Money. And from talking to David, I suspect that some of his concerns are not dissimilar from the concerns which Colin has raised in his book. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and we'll proceed as normal. The talk is on the record. David said he's very happy to have interruptions, which I think means that they're on the record, but then Chatham House rules at the end, which means that if there's anything that he'd prefer not to be on the record, he can just say later.
Great.
Very good, thanks.
Smashing. Luke, thank you very much. I mean, and thanks to the European Studies Centre and to St Anthony's and to all of you. I really love coming back to Oxford. It's my alma mater, and I had 3 wonderful years here and lots of friends. And I was taught while I was here that it was a virtue and not a vice to ask awkward questions. And so yes. I guess really that's what the book is about. My background is in finance and as a fund manager, but the question is what they do with your money, and do they do it well? And actually it's the basis of a course that we're now putting on at London Business School for graduates in finance, and it's a required course which is called The Purpose of Finance. And while we were researching whether we put the course on, we looked at all the Masters in Finance courses around the world and saw, was there any that actually thought that it would be a good idea to ask and teach the students what the purpose of finance were, and we couldn't find any, so we thought we might take a crack at thinking about that question. So I'd like to talk about that, and I will dwell, since I'm in Oxford, just a little bit on what it is that I might want to say about the way that we teach students who are going to graduate and work in the financial services industry, and whether there might be some issues there that would be helpful to address. So I suppose the overall question then is, does the financial services industry, the finance industry, does it do its job well? And if we want to answer the question of whether it does its job well, we need to start first with, well, what is its purpose? And if we can define then what its purpose is, then maybe we can measure whether that purpose is being well fulfilled. And if not, why not? And then I will start to get into some speculations about things that we might do that would perhaps make it better. Now let me start with the first question. So the first question is, what is the purpose of the finance industry? And you know, I'm always struck that for most industries it's pretty clear what their purpose is. You know, the food industry is there to make sure that we're alive and well and pleases our palate. It does all of those sorts of things. The drugs industry, you know, you swallow a chemical and you get better. I mean, we kind of know what it is that they're there for, but I really recommend to you, next time that you have people round to dinner, to ask them what is the purpose of the finance industry, because you will have a great debate, and 8 times out of 10 probably a brilliant economist around your table, but 8 times out of 10 people say it's there so that bankers can become wealthier. In fact, I remember once doing this, it was about 2009, 2010, and it was a big political gathering, and they got together sort of young, up-and-coming left-wing politicians, sort of social democratic politicians from Europe and the States and everywhere. And so I put up my hand and said, look, the finance industry has been on the front page of the newspaper for the last 18 months. What would be your agenda for the future of the finance industry? And it was one of these ones where you could see, those involuntary changes on people's expression as they looked at each other and thought, I have never thought about that question. And they discussed it amongst themselves for 20, 25 minutes, rambling away. And then there was the French politician, I've forgotten what her name was, came in and she said, I think really what we'd like is for it not to bring down the world economy. And so the financial services industry, the best that could be thought of would be that it wouldn't bring down the world economy. In other words, just if it would do no harm and go away, that would be okay. And that feels to me to be very, very far away from a good answer. If you look at the literature on what's the purpose of the finance industry, you don't discover that much. You discover quite a lot about there are these institutions which exist, therefore they must have a purpose, and we would speculate therefore that the purpose is X because they exist. But nobody ever takes a step back to say, well, but what are we trying to achieve in the first place? And my slight worry about that is that we feel a little bit like maybe somebody looking at the way that medicine was practiced in the late 18th century, saying, well, why is it that we're putting leeches on people? There must be some reason that's good for them, because people clearly do have leeches put on them and they voluntarily are happy to do that, rather than stepping back and saying, well, is this actually curing people? And I learned only recently that George Washington actually died because people took 3 3/4 litres of blood from him to try and cure him of a sore throat. So I'm dying to give this example sometime when I'm in the United States of, could it be that because we've forgotten to ask the first question about the purpose of finance, we're allowing a whole load of stuff to go on that may actually not be very useful in fulfilling what its proper purpose ought to be. And certainly, as we've looked at the curricula of the various different business schools, we weren't finding anybody who was asking that question. I mean, my 4, actually, which would be close to John Kay. It was Kay rather than Colin that had that Other People's Money title. Colin wrote the one on corporates as well, which is very close to this.
I said the wrong thing.
Yeah. But I mean, John's book is great and just beautifully, as always, written. I would have some similar considerations to him. Not quite the same, I think. His is a little bit more from the academic literature, me maybe a little bit more from history, and from sort of common person's usage. But it would seem to me that there are 4 really important purposes. I mean, one is just the safekeeping of assets. I mean, when the Bank of Amsterdam founded itself, its reputation that separated it from everybody else was that when you put your gold at the Bank of Amsterdam and you went to go and get it again, actually they gave you the same amount of money back that you'd put in, whereas everybody else would find some way of shaving around the sovereign or the doubloon or whatever it was and keeping a little bit for themselves. I was intrigued as well at the reputation of the City of London, or the goldsmiths of the City of London was such that people preferred the goldsmiths of the City of London to be issuing the currency rather than the king, because the king also had a nasty habit of sticking some lead or whatever it would be in the gold. And of course, this is really, really important. You know, if I stick my Oxfam hat on and I think how it is that people think about their assets in Haiti, they aren't able to put it in a bank because they don't trust the bank and the bank doesn't trust them. They have something where they save communally 10 people get together, they put a certain number of goods in at the end of each week, and one person takes them away, and with that they can buy something that's special. So they're saving commonly. I remember meeting Atia Rahman, who's the Governor General or the Governor of the Bank of Bangladesh, and how enormously proud he was of having invented the 10 taka account. 10 taka is about 8 pence, and that you could open a bank account, a simple deposit bank account with 8 pence. And he said, I knew this was working when the street kids in Dhaka were coming to the bank, usually with an NGO helping them, but whenever they'd earned any money, they would put it in my bank, because of course if you're a street kid and you have any money, you wander around the corner and another street kid or somebody else steals it from you. Keeping people's money safe, absolutely critical. We absolutely take for granted that that's something that you can do, and if you can't do that, it seems to me half the finance system disappears with that. Certainly one of the things that disappears with it is transaction processing. So of course once everyone's got their money in the bank and it's safe, I don't need to go into the bank and take out my gold and then give it to you so that you can put it back in the bank. Actually the bank can do that transaction between the pair of us. And so if we can do that, again, huge value to society. Again, put my Oxfam hat on. In Kenya, the telecoms industry is now allowing things to happen in transactions that are stunning. So, you know, it used to be the migrant worker would leave village, travel 200 miles, work on somebody's farm. The security van would come with the Kenyan shillings, would pay them at the end of the month. They then needed to find their friend who was going to do the dangerous thing of taking all the village's money back and then paying it out, and a lot of it got lost in the way because someone had taken the money for them, or perhaps they'd gone down to the pump halfway along, and so on and so forth. Today you put it in your phone and it goes back to your wife or it goes back to your mum. Absolutely fantastic. So keep your money safe, allow you to transact. Out of a third, which is, it allows us to share risk. It doesn't get rid of the risk, but it allows us to share it, every form of insurance. And I mean, what a huge benefit. You know, so we can drive cars, and if I make some horrible mistake, I won't be responsible for the terrible damage I've caused. I can have a house and own it, and if it burns down, if I die, I know that my dependents can be looked after. Just a massive benefit as a result of being able to share risk. But then it's the fourth bit, the fourth purpose of finance that I think is the biggest and the most important one. And that is, as we all know, intermediation. Just simply taking, I rather like the third Lord Rothschild, Jacob's dad, who was asked, you know, what is it a bank does? He said, oh, it's quite simple. We take money from point A where it is to point B where it's needed. And that's intermediation, taking money from point A where it is to point B where it's needed. And without intermediation, it's really difficult to think of how a modern economy works, how it is that we get growth, how you could buy a house, how you could found a company. If you didn't have intermediation, it's difficult to see how it is that we could give any sort of sense of social mobility for people that were working through the business system, because if you came from a modest background, where is it that you were going to get the money from? Fabulously, fabulously important. And the various different products of the finance industry, of course, take up various different parts of those four purposes. So a pension, for example, is an insurance product, so it will last you for as long from the day that you retire until the day that you die. But in order to save for that, there's a huge amount of intermediation that is required, taking your savings over a lifetime and making sure that they're properly invested. So the four purposes of finance are incredibly important. And indeed, they are so important that if you read the history of finance, the people who are noted as and who have been the sort of pioneers in financial products, they're often regarded as philanthropists. So, for example, the first pension was invented by a couple of characters called Wallace and Webster. They were both ministers of the Church of Scotland in 1740. In those days, nobody trusted the finance system because we were just half a generation away from the South Sea bubble. But they invented a pension where people would put their money over decades, which meant that if they died, their widows and orphans would be looked after. It was the precursor, of course, of Scottish widows. The Trustees Savings Bank, similarly, actually, it was another minister of the Church of Scotland that did that. And today, and I think the only financier that I know of who has won the Nobel Peace Prize is Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. And as many of you will be aware, what Muhammad Yunus does is he lends money to poor people. So Muhammad Yunus actually physically does the same as a wonga or a loan shark. But the way in which Muhammad Yunus does this is with purpose. And Muhammad Yunus wins the Nobel Peace Prize because the way in which he's been able to lend to people has meant that women in particular have been able to earn a living for themselves. These people who have been pioneers, by the way, they did need to know quite a lot technically about how finance worked. Some of the stuff that we would teach in finance courses, but that wasn't what was interesting about them. What was interesting about Wallace and Webster was that in the days of the South Sea bubble, you could trust them to look after your money for 20, 30 years. What is amazing about Muhammad Yunus was that he could lend money to poor people and he didn't need to send in a heavy in order to reclaim the money because he was trusted and the people that were borrowing from him were trusted. His finance had a purpose and it did something that was really worthwhile. And so finance, absolutely critical industry. Also, by the way, is given huge powers. It's, we live in a capitalist society. It's the capital that has the influence through the governance of the broader economy, the broader private economy. And I'd like to return to that. But at this point, I'd just say, does finance have a purpose? Yes, absolutely it does. It's absolutely critical to the modern economy and to any form of development, and frankly to most of the big problems that I can see we need to address in the world. So then I'll come to my second question. Does finance do its job well? And the unfortunate answer to that question, I think, is no. And I think it's no for two reasons. I mean, look, first, what happened in 2008, it's 8 years ago and it still influences our economy because it nearly did bring the world economy to its knees. I mean, how could that be so? I have struggled quite a bit with this and how you explain it. And I came across this lovely article. It's about the Queen. Some of you may know the story, who went down to the London School of Economics to open a building or something like that. I think it was in late 2008, and was sitting there with people that were almost as eminent as the folk in this room, and asked the question, why, she said, why did no one see this coming? And there was a sort of a bit of a shuffling of feet and nobody answered. And apparently her second thing was, had things got a bit lax then as the economy had gone down? Because we had lots of people who have been studying economics and finance, and actually it wasn't laxness. In reviewing this, the IMF, I think, were pretty clear that they believed that the economic establishment believed that the presumed ability of financial innovation to reduce risk by sharing it amongst the institutions had actually reduced the risk, and particularly in the developed world, that the financial system was indeed safe. And the thing that would worry me would not be that we made a mistake prior to 2008. My worry would be that the tools that we were using in 2008 are actually the same sort of tools that we're using today to try and think about the financial system. One study I absolutely love and quite knocks me back is that many of you will know we now have a rule, it's called Basel III, which is quite a complicated way of working out whether or not banks are likely to get themselves into trouble. So someone did the comparison, does Basel III do a better job than Basel I in predicting which banks would get themselves into trouble in 2008? No, actually it does a worse job. And by the way, Basel I does a worse job than just looking at the accounts and dividing the assets by the equity of the bank. So we seem to be using the same sort of tools. We seem to be allowing the same sort of practices. I teach this Masters in Finance class. It's for post-experienced people. And there was one bit we were talking about Repo 105, which was a way that Lehman Brothers was using of taking borrowings off its balance sheet and saying what a terrible thing, and one of the people said, yes, but you know that happens now, except what we do is dong 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 dong. And then somebody else said, yes, and here's another way you can do it, dong 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 dong. So this same behavior seems to be taking place, and indeed that we have reached a stage where, if we're not careful, the genuine insights, I think, of academic research in finance simply move across to the city and get themselves gamed, which isn't going to work particularly well, it seems to me. And I know John Vickers from this university is now doing a series of seminars saying exactly this about the watering down of the recommendations which he made, where he would be honest that these were not idealistic recommendations. These were what was possible at the time, and are now being watered down still further from that. So is finance doing a good job? I'm not convinced that we can claim it's doing a good job from the point of view of safety, but all of that might be okay if what we could see was that over time the financial system was getting ever more efficient at doing what it's doing, taking money from point A where it is to point B where it's needed. And I don't know if you're all aware of a study by a French economist called Thomas Philippon. Do people know about Thomas Philippon? For those of you who don't, I did this little handout of essentially of his work. And so what he decided he would do is he would try and work out what had been the productivity increase in the finance industry in the United States. And of course, it's very difficult to do that year to year, because you might have bad lending one year and you discover it later on. So he said, I'm going to do this over 130 years. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the income of the US GDP taken up by finance, and the amount of money that has been intermediated from point A, outside the finance system, to point B, outside the finance system. And of course, I would expect with specialization, with information technology, with communications, and let's remember communications here include the invention of the telephone, not just the invention of the internet, that there should at least have been this dramatic improvement in productivity. There has been a tenfold increase in productivity overall in the United States during that same period. If you look at the graph on the right, that looks at the unit cost of financial intermediation in the United States over 130 years. The top line is in total, and then since he was rejected from being published on this for many years until he'd shown that he'd quality adjusted that for smaller borrowers and lenders and so on and so forth, the orange ditty-dotty line shows what the cost has been. And here's the uncomfortable conclusion. His evidence is, even with all those adjustments, there has been no increase in productivity in the finance system whatsoever. I mean, you know, we've been teaching people finance, we've had all these dramatic improvements in enabling technologies, and the irony is that we've got, it appears, nowhere. Now, it seems to me that there are lots of implications for that. I mean, one quite interestingly is that if you are convinced by Thomas Piketty, I'm not particularly convinced by Thomas Piketty, but he's got this assumption that capital will make a 5% real return. But of course, once it's been intermediated through the finance system, that will take 2% off the return, so that's down to 3%, and so we don't need to worry about that argument any longer. We just need to worry about the people in finance taking their 2% off it. But for our argument, I think it's really, really challenging that in finance, over 130 years, you can have the best study that we have on this subject, where a man says that the finance industry that financed the railroads is as efficient as the finance industry that is financing the internet. And that really, I suppose, therefore, is the starting point for the book.
I hope we can come back and discuss this claim in more detail.
Indeed.
In questions. I won't ask you a specific question now, but put it on notice.
But you're welcome.
No.
Okay.
I think you would get tangled up in this and that number if I did. So, but I will later.
Good. And that's really the starting point in the book, and it's the starting point in the book as well, because the book is what they do with your money, and I'll come back to that, the your bit, in a bit. But let me see if I can tease out where I think the difficulties might be arising for finance. And I'd like to start with academia, because I'm in Oxford, and if I've already got a debate, I hope I have more of a debate coming from this. I mean, we always, I remember being taught when I did PPE of economics was that it was the queen of the social sciences, because this was one that had real rigour, and you could put mathematical answers on what it was that you were saying. And certainly as I wander up and down the corridors of the finance department at London Business School, there is no lack of algebraic rigour in the papers that people are writing, and I'm sure that they are all consistent within themselves. But I would be really concerned that in developing something that is rigorous, that we've assumed away the things that make it real. I mean, as I remember my Adam Smith, he was keen that economics would be a study that would help provide a plentiful revenue to the people and supply the state with a revenue sufficient for the public services. And that if we had done that, you might have thought that in finance we would be finding a way of making sure that intermediation today was at lower cost and more effective than intermediation in the past. And I would worry a little bit that what we are teaching people is that the existence of markets and the existence of competition in and of itself will create good outcomes. It's that same point that I was making at the beginning about if you check back through the evidence and say, where's the debate about the purpose of finance, rather than banks exist, therefore they must have a purpose, that we don't seem to be having that. This, by the way, is not that I want to reject the real advances that have been made in understanding the way economic systems work, but it's kind of like, if that's the only thing we teach, it's a bit like teaching someone biochemistry and then saying, and now you can go and practice to be a doctor. It's not that biochemistry isn't important if you want to understand how to become a doctor. It's just it's not sufficient. Indeed, it might even be a wee bit more awkward than that. There's a lovely study by Frank and others which reviews the evidence of whether, I think the title is, does studying economics inhibit cooperation? Because of course the economic assumption is that everyone is self-interested and they go into transactions trying to be self-interested. So there are various different ways that people have done this, but basically they study people as they go through economics courses and people that go through other sort of similar social science or arts courses and watch their behaviour and conclude that at their end there is quite strong evidence that those people who are studying economics are people who not only behave rather more self-interested in stylized games than other people do, but also they assume other people will do that. And I would have a little bit of a worry that if we graduate people in economics as being the study that helps you understand how finance works, so off you go to the Treasury, off you go to the FCA, off you go to the Bank of England, off you go to Barclays, that we may actually be, ironically, doing something that is undermining the basis on which markets work in the first place. Because, you know, serious economists are very clear that for markets and transactions to work in the first place, the degree of trust, the degree of ethics, the degree of common understanding is extremely fundamental to that. And it may be that not only does our economic curriculum is just blind to that, but it also it could be undermining it. And in the financial world, which is characterized by multiple principals and agents with profound asymmetric information, it is simply not the case that, absent thinking about the institutions of finance, that markets and competition are likely to work. Indeed, there's even one a thing that we've put on as part of this course on the purpose of finance, where we do a buying and selling game for the students. So we have 3 groups of students who are fund managers, and then most of the others buy from the fund managers. And we give the fund managers various different funds that they are able to sell, which, if you take them in aggregate, their performance is either flat relative to the market or down relative to the market. But of course, for each of them, there are 1 or 2 funds that actually have been outperforming, and they look pretty good. And we do manage to get our post-experience, you know, late 20s, early 30s students to make catastrophically poor decisions about who it is that they're going to manage their money, on the assumption that the information that they're giving them is comprehensive information. Now, that is a tiny and stylized piece of asymmetric information, but it already creates a situation where people are simply not making the right choices and prices are being forced up as a result of that. You'd say, well, that couldn't happen, could it? But in the real world, but I would argue the 28,000 different funds that people might invest their pension in suggests that perhaps there is rather more choice than's needed, and perhaps that it's only a few of those 28,000 funds, viz. The ones that are performing well, that are being sold. I'd suggest the fact that if you take a focus group of people and you ask them whether or not it matters whether they're charged 1% or 1.5% on their pension fund, they'll say no, not really. But they won't know that 1% charged every year on your pension fund is 25% of your possible pension gone. 2% is 50% of your possible pension gone. In the finance industry, we don't even tell people what the total cost is of your investment, to such a degree that Railpen, which is 23 billion, it's one of the more progressive pension funds in the UK, put a great effort into doing this. They thought they were being charged £75 million to manage their 23 billion. But when they looked at all the structured products, so this is when you're invested in a fund but it invests in another fund, when they looked at all the costs of trading, all the taxes, all the rest of it, that would have to come off the top of cost-free investment, they've discovered that 75 had moved to 290 million. So it was 4 times
out
what
of a
they
total
thought
of what funds in. There's a per annum charge of 290 million on what managed?
On 23 billion. So that would be about 1.3%. So 1.3% over the 25-year life of Railpen would mean about 30% of their of what their assets. So this is billions upon billions of pounds. And I'm pleased to say they now have got that cost down by 100 million. But they didn't even know they had 100 million to start. To save when they started all of this. And I wonder whether, you know, it might be useful as we think about, and I know that some people do, and this is not a general criticism and so on, but I do worry a bit that as we think about how we teach economics, particularly financial economics, we don't need this to be a broader subject. I mean, I remember I chose PPE because it was politics and philosophy as well as economics, and it was thought that if you wanted to understand economics, then perhaps the politics and philosophy were useful parts of that as well. And I worry just a little bit that if economics has become so stylized that to be able to study it at this university, to do that wonderful degree, you need an A star in mathematics, that we might not be missing out an awful lot of people who would be able to benefit the world as civil servants, as politicians, as people in the Treasury and so on, as a result of that. So that might be one of my challenges. Remember, Wallace and Webster were wonderful because they were able to get a pension fund to work, not just because the professor of mathematics at Edinburgh University helped them out, but it was because they could be trusted. And I remember Gillian Tett, the FT journalist, once telling me that when she first interviewed for a job as a young graduate, there's some very old a person at the Bank of England who was wheeled in to do the last sort of 20 minutes and said, well, what did you study? And she said, I studied anthropology. And he said, oh yes, by far the best subject if you're going to study finance. And I thought that was quite an interesting view of you need to understand the institutions and the cultures as much as you need to understand the mathematics. So that for academics. I think we could say stuff about regulation as well. You know, people go on about light touch regulation. There are 37 times the number of regulators per head of the financial population today than there were in 1980. We haven't been short of writing regulations. 1990, 3,000 pages of pension regulation. 2010, 80,000 pages of pensions regulation. Why? I think it's because we've got ourselves in a situation where it either needs to be the market or regulation. So whenever the market breaks, you put in another micro regulation in order to try and fix that. Where regulators are grabbing insights that do come from academic study, but they too are abusing them. You know, the value at risk in an investment portfolio doesn't tell you very much about what's going to happen in a crisis. It's a pretty dangerous thing to be using normal distributions if you're looking at how it is, whether banks are safe or not. And this, of course, is one of the big things that John Vickers is now saying, that the Bank of England is explicit in saying in normal times, the reserving that we have for banks, the capital adequacy of banks is adequate in normal times. But that's not what we need to know. He says it's a little bit like saying that the flood defences will work providing we don't have a storm. It just isn't a sensible way to be thinking about this. So one of the other things we might want to discuss would be, look, do we need to change a little bit the way that we think about regulation? And I think more generally, do we need to think about this as a human system? It's a human system of institutions, it's a human system of cultures, it's a human system of politics, that you need to build those and the system of governance amongst them so that it's fulfilling your purpose well. I mean, my background in finance really was about corporate governance and trying to reform corporate governance and see what it is that we could do about that. But if I was to use the same criteria of openness on corporate governance for our financial service intermediaries, I would find them desperately wanting. Yeah. I mean, come on, I haven't even told how much it is costing me to manage my pension, leave alone how much that's going to affect my pension. I mean, if intermediaries were truly on our side, what a difference that could make. And I do say our side as well, because I think there is an issue that those of the left of centre look at the failures of the finance system and say, well, this is normal, we always knew that capitalism was bad. But actually the big pots of capital today are not just wealthy people. The bigger pots of capital are CalPERS and Hermes and Railpen, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway that represents 7 million people, or even Oxford University, which is trying to look after the students and the future of this. Do you know how much of the expected 4% return that you might be making permanently from the Oxford endowment is disappearing on fees? If you do, you're really, really ahead of the game. And I remember giving a talk something like this at Cambridge, and they were shocked to learn that there was one particular remuneration package that almost certainly they had voted for, since 98% of the shareholders did vote for it, which meant that the chief executive of one of the biggest research and development spenders in Britain, his remuneration will be unaffected if he buys a company and it goes bad. But his remuneration will be affected if he spends money on research and development and that goes bad. I've forgotten what was in the charter of Cambridge University, but it was everywhere to promote research, innovation and investment therein, and yet there was their endowment not being used for it. And the bottom line, imagine if you were to be able to take the number of times the chief executive said, I did this for the shareholders, I did this for my customers as a bank, an insurer, or as an investor. Imagine that that was really true. Imagine that this was our money and we treated it like it was our money. And people say, well, are you sure about this, David? Don't investors already make their voice known? And I tell this story, it's a little bit old now. It was about a drugs company. It was about a drugs company that was suing the Indian government over a patent breach. And had they been successful in doing this, then the deal that had been done for the licensing of drugs to the third world would potentially have been breached. So it was quite a serious thing that they were doing. And it was Oxfam, long before I was at Oxfam, who ran the campaign through a group called Fair Pensions. And they got people to write into their fund manager saying, we want you to put pressure on this drugs company to stop doing this. And I remember afterwards at a dinner sitting opposite a portfolio manager, he said, God, that was a really amazing campaign, that, wasn't it? I said, what was it? That's really, why do you say that? He said, I've got more letters, more emails about that than I've had on every other issue for the last 5 years from people that were invested in my funds and from pension funds. And I said, well, that's amazing. How many emails and letters and calls did you get? He said, I got 6. This was somebody who was investing the money of hundreds of thousands of people, and that 6 spoke up, made a difference. So I think that if we go back and think about the purpose of finance, if we think about this as being our money, there are huge opportunities, not for some revolution to take place, not to wait until the next financial crisis, but bit by bit to start from the right perspective, our money purposefully invested. A couple of more things I'll say and then I'll be quiet and leave time for some debate. Here's an institution, for example, it seems to me to be a brain-dead obvious institution that ought to exist in the UK. The purpose of a pension is to pay you an income from the point you retire until the point you die, so that you don't need to worry about how long you're going to live. The problem is you don't know how long you're going to live. You might die the next day, or you might live until you're 105. The way in which we can overcome this is that we can save commonly, as they would in Holland, into one big common pot. And we can trust that the trustees of the common pot will let out a reasonable amount of money relative to the money that people have put in, so that they can have a pension. If you do that, you need to save about a bit more than half of what it is that you would need to do if you wanted to protect yourself, so that you were, 97% likely not to run out of money. Indeed, so big is this effect that if there were 2 twins one in Holland and one in the UK, and they both saved exactly the same amount for their pension. They retired on the same day, they had exactly the same life expectancy, but the poor British person suffered pension fund fees in the UK and then had to buy an annuity, and the Dutch person had a properly designed collective pension scheme. For exactly the same amount of money, the Dutch person would have a 50% higher pension. A 50% increase in productivity by the adoption of the Dutch pension system over the UK pension system. By the way, if you want to think about the significance just of that one simple reform, 6.5% of our GDP is each year put into private pensions. They could be 50% more productive just by having the simple collective Dutch system. It's illegal in this country because of so many path dependencies where we regulated out people who had abused their market advantage in things like with profits policy. So there is a huge advantage to be got here. I don't ever think that you finally get there, but you do need to start with purpose. You do need to measure why that is being properly fulfilled. There are lots and lots of things that you can do, because this is an ecosystem finance of institutions, of markets, of cultures, of regulations. We need institutions which deliver, and they should be ones that are designed to deliver to private and social purpose, not the ones that succeed in markets of mass asymmetric information where people don't know what it is that they're buying. We don't need some grand plan of where we're going. It doesn't need a crisis to be able to do this. Oxford University and its endowment, for example, you in your pension could usefully ask, what is it that I'm being charged? Could usefully ask, how is it that it's being invested? And we could move this forward so that the amazing things that the finance industry contributes to could be properly fulfilled. I must say, sometimes I give this talk, particularly to people in the city, and they say, "Oh, you're just such an idealist, Pitt-Watson. This is about making money. This is what we do around here. We don't need to worry about this purpose stuff." And sometimes it gets me a wee bit depressed. Now, I was before Christmas, and you always feel a little bit tired out before Christmas, because the nights are drawing in and it's getting dark. And I'd probably done one of these talks, and I went home, and I was watching that James Stewart film. I don't know if you know, It's a Wonderful Life, and it's about this guy who's going to commit suicide. And because he never really fulfilled his dream, which was to go to some grand university and make some real impact on the world. Actually, he'd stayed at home and he'd just done his job properly, and it was all terribly boring. And his guardian angel comes to see him and shows him what his life would otherwise have been like, and what his town would otherwise have been like if he hadn't fulfilled the purpose of his job properly. And it's the ultimate feel-good film, and James Stewart goes home to his family and he feels absolutely wonderful. And do you know what James Stewart did? He was a banker. Thanks.
Thank you very much.